So again, for those of you who are newish around here and haven't met him, this is Professor Piguet, who wants the microphone out of my hands. Olivier has over 20 years clinical and research experience in the field of aging and neurodegeneration. And alongside being the current director of Frontier, he is an NHMRC Leadership Fellow and Professor of Clinical Neuropsychology here at the University of Sydney. And for those of you who follow us on Facebook, you'll know that he's quite an accomplished runner. And for the third year running this year has led the Frontier running team in the City to Surf. I think this year they raised around about $1,000. Yep. And he now has the running bug and has also completed the Sydney Half Marathon this year and will be running in the Auckland Half Marathon in November. Next year, he plans to do the Sydney Half Marathon again, as well as the Midnight Sun Half Marathon in Tromsø in Norway. That sounds fantastic if you take running out of the picture. So without, here you go, over to Olivier. You can share your fact about Rubik's Cubes.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. It's very nice to see familiar faces and new faces too. Things have changed a lot in the field of frontotemporal dementia in the past 15 years since we started Frontier. And what I was going to do is, because there are new faces, is to go through a little bit about what frontotemporal dementia is, and to clarify some of the why is it so difficult to get a diagnosis, and try to explain some of these difficulties. And then I wanted to also outline some of the activities that we've done and what are the achievements of the group over the past few years. If you have questions, don't hesitate, interrupt, and raise your hand. But yeah, running is well, I got to an age where I thought I needed to do something in terms of physical exercise, and running is easy. But I realized that I actually didn't like running. It took me about 2 years to start enjoying it, and even now it's not always the case. But there's goals, and raising funds for the Australian FTD Association is a good cause, so it motivates me to do that. All right, so Frontier we started in 2008. And apologies for people who've seen some of these slides before, but again, I think it's important to lay the context for new people who are here with us today. So it started with Professor John Hodges, who came from Cambridge in the UK with a Federation Fellowship from the Australian Research Council to establish Frontier. And so that's our first Christmas lunch in 2007. So it was just 5 of us. And then that's a recent photo of the team. So we were at UNSW until 2016, and then there was an offer for us to move to Sydney University, and we've been here since 2017 at the Brennan Mind Centre. So the group has grown, and it varies from year to year depending on the number of students we have, postdoctoral fellows, and also the funding that we get from various grants. And at the moment, I think we have about a team of 20 people. So coming back to frontotemporal dementia actually was identified before Alzheimer's disease. I know that most people, when they think dementia, they think Alzheimer's disease, memory problems. When you review the literature, the first cases that were then labeled, ended up being labeled frontotemporal dementia, were reported by this person, Arnold Peak, who is a Czech neurologist. And he reported new cases of people with focal brain atrophy, which had never been reported before. And this case series of patients most of them had language presentations rather than behavioral variant, as is more common now. And then when Alzheimer, who is a neuropathologist, looked at the brain of some of these cases, he discovered that the pathology was different to that had been reported for people with Alzheimer's disease. So that became a different disorders that Alzheimer actually labeled as Pick's disease, following the name of Arnold Pick. But then there's the black hole of research on frontotemporal dementia where pretty much nothing happens until we get to mid-50s, a couple of papers, but then even in the 70s, we get clinically the people or clinicians indicating that you couldn't differentiate frontotemporal dementia from Alzheimer's disease, which we know is not really the case. And it's only in the mid-90s that we have the first classifications or guidelines to try to differentiate frontotemporal dementia from Alzheimer's disease. And then only 14 years ago now, there are these two papers that looked at, that formalized the classifications of frontotemporal dementia with these two articles, one focusing on the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, and the other one looking more at the language presentations. And that was great because then there was a common language that people could share across sites, across clinicians, across research groups. So then we could also follow the same guidelines in terms of identifying people, the diagnosis, and the features, clinical presentation, symptoms that would be needed to make sure that we're looking at the same thing in terms of underlying disease presentation. But as always, there's the intentions and then the reality. The reality is not always as plain. And so if we follow that classifications, then we have a classification of FTD syndromes that, and you've heard these terms: behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, semantic dementia, progressive non-fluent aphasia. But if you go through the paper on the left, then you have a slightly different nomenclature labels. So you have semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia, non-fluent variant of primary progressive aphasia, and then logopenic variant of primary progressive aphasia. So they're long words. And so these semantic dementia and progressive non-fluent aphasia are essentially reflecting the same thing as the semantic variant and non-fluent variant PPA. But when you go to the doctor, you might hear one label and then another one, and you might think, well, why is this changing? Is that the same thing or is it different? And if it's different, why is it, why can't we just use the same words? The reason for that, or one of the reasons is, so in red, you have, this is part of the frontotemporal dementia umbrella of presentations, if you want. In green, it's the language presentations. I've put logopenic variant of PPA outside the red box because, as I'll explain in a minute, what is happening in the brain of people with logopenic variant of PPA is not frontotemporal dementia, is actually related to Alzheimer's disease. So that's one of the challenges in terms of clinical presentations and understanding of these presentations. So, yeah, complex brain disorders with multiple presentations and pathologies. And certainly when you read papers, what we all try to do is to have nice categories. You have the behavioral variant, FTD, semantic variant, and so on. So they're nicely separated, but the reality again is very different, where it's more like this, where you have someone presenting with a little bit of language problems, but also behavioral changes. And then the disease progresses and you have other things emerging, might be more behavioral changes, becoming more apathetic, more language problems, but also sometimes also motor problems, difficulty walking, difficulty with coordinating movements. And so then how do you deal with that is one of the challenges in terms of allocating a label, and is a label that you get at the beginning is also reflecting what is happening later in the disease is difficult. And that's another depiction of the overlap between these different presentations. And then you have that. So that's outlining the pathologies of in frontotemporal dementia, and I'll walk you through these things a little bit. So in the middle, you have FTLD, so that's the broad umbrella term. If you look at the top, you have the clinical presentation, so behavioral variant, and then the semantic non-fluent, and then you have other disorders, FTD-MND, so FTD with motor neuron disease, and CBS, that's cortical basal syndrome, and PSP-RS, it's progressive supranuclear palsy. So they're more motor presentations of frontotemporal dementia. Now, the colors are related to what is happening in the brain, and you have the different colors underneath. So at pathological levels, so what are the changes that are happening in the brain have been categorized in these broad 4 groups. So you have FTLD, tau, TDP, FET, and UPS. So if we take semantic dementia is mostly this shade of blue, which is related to this type of pathology in the brain. So in the majority of people who receive a diagnosis of semantic dementia, the pathology is well known and is predictable, which is all well and good. But then you get to something like the non-fluent presentation, so progressive non-fluent phase, and you can see that the colors are already more varied. And certainly a large portion of people will have these changes associated with tau in the brain, and it can be different types of tau, but some will have also the same pathology that you can find in semantic dementia. And some people will also have Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain. So at the clinical level, it might not make a difference how you go about addressing some of the symptoms that a person may show. But in terms of treatments and drugs that may become available, it becomes extremely important to try to understand which type of pathology someone has. Because if you have a drug that is targeting, say, this type of pathology, then if you have someone presenting with the same symptoms but who belongs in that group, that drug will not make any difference to their management. So we need to be able to understand what is the relationship between brain pathology and clinical presentation. And then you have the behavioral variant presentation. You can see that the range of colors. So at this point in time, we know that this is associated with pretty much anything, all these different pathologies, and that again in life it's very difficult to predict what is happening in the brain. And then you have the logopenic variant primary progressive aphasia that I've mentioned before, that is related primarily to Alzheimer's disease pathology. So just going through the big question mark is still the relationship between how the clinical presentation is related to what is happening in the brain. And so one pathology can lead to multiple symptoms, and one symptoms to multiple pathologies, and you get that sort of things in reality. Well, on the left-hand side, you have the different types of pathologies, and on the right, it's showing how it's related to the different clinical presentations. So yeah, you don't need to understand all these things, but you can see the variability in these things. So there are groups that are more closely connected. So for example, if you have Lewy body, you're more likely to have some movement disorders in life. If you have Alzheimer's disease, you're still more likely to have memory problems. Again, as I was saying, a small portion of people who have Alzheimer's disease in the brain will end up with a language presentation primarily. So the one of the major issues with that complexity is that, as you've probably went through these processes, that it takes a long time to get a diagnosis. Often we hear stories of families going from one GP to another, not knowing, getting conflicting information, and being seen by psychiatrists and many different medical professions before getting to the right diagnosis. And we know that on average, individual with frontotemporal dementia, it will take on average about 4 years to get a proper diagnosis, which is an awful long time when you have these difficulties emerging and difficulties in life related to thinking abilities or functioning. When you look at people with Alzheimer's disease, in general, it's much shorter. The difficulty with a diagnosis in frontotemporal dementia is that the age of often when people are starting to show some changes. When you have changes in behavior and personality in your 40s, 50s, the diagnosis of dementia is obviously not the thing you start thinking about. You start thinking more about psychiatric conditions and so on. That's what also causes this delay. Because we think dementia, we think that is something that is more likely to happen in someone in their 70s, 80s, so associated with age. So there's these issues in that usually a younger population, people affected, but also difficulties then related to other challenges in life, because people are generally younger. It means that you might still have young families, you might still be in the workforce. So there are some the impact of the frontotemporal dementia is very different to someone who gets dementia much later in life. Because of the complexity, there's also a barrier to drug development. So and I'll talk about that in minutes, because the complexity, you're trying to identify one molecule or one new medications that will make a difference in a particular subgroup is quite difficult to develop. And we know that people know much less about, people know a little bit about dementia in general. People know a bit less about Alzheimer's disease, and often there's a confusion about, well, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? But certainly when you start talking about frontotemporal dementia, there's much less awareness of that. And I'm certainly grateful for FTD Awareness Week, because that's a way also for us to disseminate this information and making people more aware that dementia is not just memory problems, and there's many more types of dementia than Alzheimer's disease. And we know that also that there's a particular burden on carers and family members, and more so in people looking after individuals who have a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia compared to people with Alzheimer's disease. So what do we do? How do we function here at Frontier? And again, you will have seen GP, geriatricians, neurologists, and they might have suggested to come to see us. So what we do is that we get referrals from many sources. And then, as you know, you would have gone through some or all of these different aspects where we will get clinical information from you, from your doctors, and then the participants will go through a range of tests looking at different aspects of thinking abilities, functional abilities. We also do brain MRI scans. biomarkers. Some of you will have donated blood samples. We look at the genes in some instances, as I said, information from carers. And then we also have a brain donation program. And this process is repeated on a yearly basis for as long as you want to come or as long as you're able to come. And for us, that's a way to accumulate information at an individual level and to understand what are the typical features of presentations and how these features change over time. And so with this information, that helps us in terms of refining the diagnosis. So making sure that when you came, you got the right information and the right classification, if you want. And also trying for us to help understand the progression and then find ways to support you in this journey, in ways to address some of the behavioral difficulties, language difficulties, but also in terms of pointing them in the right directions in terms of services that may be available and suitable for you. So there's a very practical aspect. Then there's a more, I would say, scientific aspect in the work that we do in that with this information, it also helps us understand how humans think. How does the brain work? What are the bits that certain parts of the brain are responsible for? So we get to develop some models of cognition about memory, about some behavior, and understanding what it is that some features are more common in some presentations, like apathy, disinhibition, looking at also behavior. And the importance is that these things also feed into one another, in that what we observe clinically will help us ask questions at a more scientific level. Okay, sorry, I need to stay here. I can't move too much because there's the camera. For people online, I apologize for people online. So I'll stop moving. And then the scientific questions also will help us in terms of guiding our clinical work. So some of the research projects that many of you will have participated in and the things we are interested in cognition, social cognition, and so on. So the list here, what I wanted to tell you a little bit about is what we've done in the space of neuroimaging, just to show you some of the things we can do. Because many of you will have done an MRI scan, and so you might think, well, what is it for? What do you do with this information? I mean, it takes a long time. You lie for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes in a tube that makes a lot of noise, and that is quite uncomfortable. But that's one example of the information that we get in with these MRI scans. So here, what it's showing is that we've been able to map the changes, not so much in the nerve cells themselves that we know will progressively die because of the progression of disease, but also how the changes are affecting the white matter, which is the connecting fibers between the different brain regions. And if you look from here it's showing some slices of brain. So there's horizontal slices here, there are vertical slices here, and then there's more sideways slices. But what is important is looking at the pattern of where the red bits are, which are showing the regions where these changes are happening, depending on the clinical presentations that you have. So on the top, it's the behavioral brain, frontotemporal dementia. Here's the progressive non-frontal phase, and here's semantic dementia. And on the right, it's showing the same information in a brain that is rotating, yes.
I always get confused when I'm looking at this one. Like you've got the 0 to the 100 over there. Is 0 meaning you're wanting to see 0 of that FTC reduction? Or
Yes.
you want it to be?
Yes. So it's showing that there's more change.
So
Yes.
the yellow and everything's obviously more significant to the red.
Correct. Yeah. So if you look at semantic dementia, what it's showing is that there's way more changes on one side in the temporal lobe, which is located near your ear, and on the left-hand side mostly. But you can see that it's not just there, but it's also extending more to the back. And here it's showing again that it's affecting a number of brain regions, or the connecting fibers of many brain regions. So it's more than what we think is happening at the nerve cell level. So that's one of the things we can do. And then we can also do that using the longitudinal information, is to map the changes. And in mapping these changes, what we then do is look at the profile of what is happening over time, and trying to understand how someone is changing from, say, year 1 to year 2. And then this information can also be used to design theoretical models of change over time, but also can be potentially used as biomarker for clinical trials. So if we know how much change there is from one year to the next, then we can see with a new drug or new intervention whether we can measure whether this intervention or this new drug is changing the rate at which the change is happening from one time to the next. And then we can also use that information, relating that to some clinical features. In this instance was the production of words, how changes in how some of these words were said were related to additional changes in the brain. So there's a number of things that can be done. So it's quite a flexible and powerful way to examine and understand how these disorders are changing in the brain and how it shows clinically. Now, obviously, as I said, we're interested in the science itself, but it's not just that. For me, it's really important that whatever we do is contributing to a better management of people with the disease, with frontotemporal dementia, but also helping clinicians understand these disorders better. So whenever they see someone, they can have resources that will help them in their clinical journey in identifying people with frontotemporal dementia earlier and more consistently. And so one of the things that we've been working on and work with David, who's sitting at the back here, is David's been interested in developing instruments for clinicians and making these instruments simple. So for someone who goes and see their GP, the GP can administer simple tests. The ACE takes 10 minutes, and then the GP can plug in the information in that web page, and then there's a risk of dementia that emerges. So again, that will help with the management of the person. And through publications as well, and again, David and Morel, who's sitting at the back as well, they've been publishing this paper on informing clinicians about, well, what is available and recommendation once you've had the diagnosis. So what is around, how can you orient your patients to appropriate services? Over the years, we've developed some tools, again, other calculators, tests, guides to manage behavior, and so a range of resources for clinicians and researchers who are interested in that space. we're also actively involved with other services that exist already in the community. So carer conversations, who will be speaking later this morning. Internationally with the FTD Disorders Registry, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in minutes. And another one is rare dementia support. So it's trying to really, for us to link to at the national level, but also at the international level with other organizations that are also involved in that space. The reason that is important is, again, it's a rare disorder, so we need to pull all the information that we have to make sure that we all work together, and because we need as much information as we can to make progress, because we see here in the clinic, we see I don't know, 70, 80, 90 people a year, but it's almost not enough for us to be able to understand at a scientific level what is happening. So we need to be able to connect with other people around the world who are doing the same type of work to make sure that we collaborate. So there's a lot of questions about clinical trials for obvious reasons. What people want to know is often there are I always say there's three questions that people ask: is the what, the how long, and is there a cure? So what the diagnosis, the prognosis, and then is there treatment for that? You probably will have heard that for Alzheimer's disease, there are now 2 drugs that have been approved by the TGA on the market. So at the top, there's what is labeled clinical status from no symptoms. So there's the timeline here from birth to death, but a period where there's no symptoms, and then a period where symptoms emerge. And then there's the potential window of opportunity for intervention. So you can target preventive measures. So try to, and there have been a lot of work done trying to understand what are the risk factors for dementia in general. And we know that there are things like, eating well, sleeping well, getting some exercise, being socially involved is good for you, and not drinking too much, and all these things that we know are good for the body, also good for the mind. So that's the space where you can look at these preventative measures. And then there's a space where there's this transition between no symptom to symptoms emerging, where you want to have disease-modifying interventions, and then you can also look at the symptomatic therapies. So once the disease is here, it's working at the same time trying to delay the progression of disease, but also how you can address some of the symptoms that are problematic or difficult to, or that make that impact on the daily functioning of the person. So again, thinking about behavior management, language retraining, and the like. So as I said, in Alzheimer's disease now, there are some drugs that are targeting this. In frontotemporal dementia, we're still at that level. So there's no drugs that have been approved. There are clinical trials currently underway in Australia that are being led by pharmaceutical companies, and 2 in particular called Prevail and Electa. These clinical trials are for people, a very small subgroup of people with frontotemporal dementia. It's for people who have a familial form of frontotemporal dementia. So a gene mutation has been identified on this gene called GRN, that when people have this gene mutation, they will develop the disease, and we know what pathology they will have in the brain. So if you go back to the slide where I had all the different colored pathologies, this is really targeting people with a single color, with a single pathology, and people who we know will develop the disease because they have a gene mutation, unfortunately. And at the moment, there's two. So there's PREVAIL, which is a very early phase 1-2 trial. So they really looking at efficacy of the drug, whether it works or not. And this drug is a gene vector intervention. So it's a one-off injection in the back of the brain, and trying to see if it's injecting a modified version of the faulty gene. So it's trying to replace the gene that has the bad mutation with a copy of the gene that doesn't have this mutation. And what they will do is that they will see over 5 years whether it changes at a brain level. If you can see that there are fewer brain cells being lost, and also less accumulations of the protein that is also contributing to the progression of the disease. The other one is Alecta, which is a phase 3, so a larger group of people. This one, they've recruited, I think, about 16 people around the world. So it was a very small number of people. This one was larger. It's a monthly injection for 1 to 2 years. And the clinical trial now is closed, and we're expecting results in the next few months from that trial. Now, as I said, it's just for this very specific group of people, but the findings will also be important to understand how this new drug works in the brain, even for people who don't have this gene mutation. So it will have important implications for a larger group of people. But again, very selective inclusion criteria. So other things that are happening in Australia, there's one trial looking at sodium selenate that is led by people in Melbourne. And it's targeting people who, 2 minutes. All right, okay. Who have tau pathology in the brain. So people who have these, again, if you go back to my slides of the different colors, who have the reddish pathology in the brain, that was on the left-hand side. And then we're also looking at whether CBD could be used to target some behavioral changes, but that's very early stages. And other things that we've been doing, we've been running some behavior program, looking at positive behavior support and Carers Way Ahead that James will talk about in a minute at some point today. And then the PPA communication project that many of you will have participated in with Penny and Kiri Baland. In terms of collaborations, as I said, it's important that we are engaged with many other groups. So in Australia, with Dementia Australia, the AFDD, and so on, and also internationally, we're part of big consortia looking at the genetics aspects, neuropsychiatric consortium with South America, with Europe. So we really are actively engaged. I just wanted to finish by highlighting a couple of meetings that we went to. So a number of us were in Toronto in last month, or in July. And it's the Alzheimer's conference. It's the annual conference. It's a big conference, about 8,000 people attending that conference. But what I took out of this conference this year is, unlike previous years, there was a greater awareness or space for non-Alzheimer's dementia. And there were a few sessions on frontotemporal dementia. And I was invited to talk about neuropsychiatric symptoms in frontotemporal dementia as part of this conference. So again, there's increasing awareness of non-Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia. And also we had a number of posters, and Jess in the middle won the best prize, or the prize for best poster at the conference. Last week I was in Washington, DC, for a research roundtable on frontotemporal dementia and clinical trials. Small group of people, but that involved legislators and so the FDA in the US as well as European Drug Administration, and it was around clinical trials and what are the things that we need to do? And there was a broad discussion around the importance of data sharing, because there's a lot of people collecting information and the need to share this information as much as possible. Because whenever I ask people, you do a lot for us in terms of testing, and often what I hear is, yeah, use my data, do something with it. And from a clinical trials viewpoint, often pharma companies are a bit reluctant in sharing data, and that was having the pharma companies in the room with the FDA, with the EMA, and to discuss that and to say, well, we need to be able to share this data much more. We also looked at different biomarkers. So what are the potential clinical, the targets for clinical trials, particularly in the other types of FTD, so looking at tau and TDP. And I was walking around and I found that there's a place called Foggy Bottom in Washington, DC, which actually is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Washington. It was called Foggy Bottom because it was quite swampy and foggy in the morning. So there you go. But yeah, and this graph is just looking at the number of publications on frontotemporal dementia from the year 2000. You can see that it's rising exponentially. So there's increasing awareness, increasing work being done, but we're making progress. But we need to do more, and we are doing more. All right, I'll stop here. And that photo is from the Alzheimer's meeting in Amsterdam last year, where we ended up on a canal one night having a drink. So thank you.